Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads. And this is going to be a bit of a recent reads. I've gotten a bit behind on these, so I think I'm going to break them up somewhat semi-thematically. And today's theme is going to be language, I think. So first up is a piece of nonfiction, and this is Beyond the Mother Tongue, The Postmonolingual Condition by Yasmin Yildiz, who is a professor in the German department at UCLA, although at the time she published this, she was at the University of Illinois. This is a really interesting look at, in part, literature, but also kind of the politics behind the way we classify literature. She is specifically looking at how writers working in the German language are framed as not being native German speakers, even when they are, essentially because Germany is a country that has a kind of monolingual myth, where the idea is that there is a national language, and if you are not part of the majority, then this national language doesn't really belong to you, even if it is the language that you're writing in, and even if it's your native language. And in the introduction, she does make the point that this is not unique to Germany. This is something that happens in a lot of countries that have a national language, like France. It happens in countries that don't technically have a national language, but culturally do, like the United States. And how it is myth-building to talk about authors who are, in fact, native German speakers, as though they are not. And how this is this monolingual myth to imply that you can only have one mother tongue because so many people are raised in more than one language. And in most of the world, that is the most common point. Because she is a professor of German, she is specifically looking at writers working in German, and specifically German Jewish and Turkish German writers. And in each chapter she talks about a specific author and evaluates specific pieces of their work. The first chapter is about Franz Kafka, who I think people erroneously assume spoke Yiddish as his first language, but he didn't. He said, learned that on his own later, and he was a native German speaker, and the idea that he wasn't is based in a kind of nationalism that a lot of the people who would write about him would pretend that they don't engage in. She similarly talks about the way people talk about Feridun Zaimulu, who, yes, wasn't born in Germany, but he moved there at 2, so clearly German is still his native and dominant language because of the language of education, and she's making a lot of that point. Some of the more interesting parts, I thought, were actually where she gets into authors who are not necessarily native German speakers, but who use it as their dominant or artistic language. And the main example that she uses for that is the title story, Mother Tongue, in this collection of Emine Sevgi Özdamar's Mother Tongue, which is, the middle part is a kind of absurdist, surrealist bit with talking donkeys, but the first section is about this woman in Berlin and is narrated using a language that is essentially literally translating Turkish idiom into German. And this one that I'm holding up here, which I read after reading the book, it's an English translation, but it does the same thing. And one of the things that Yildiz is pointing out in this book is that that story doesn't work when it's translated into Turkish, because the fact of the idiom being different is what makes that particularly clever. And she talks about how that is, in effect, something that's kind of untranslatable, but only in certain directions. So even though it was written in German, you could translate that into English or into French, but you couldn't really translate it and keep the spirit of it into Turkish or into similar languages that have some of the similar idiom, like Azerbaijani or something like that. So that's all really interesting. This is also a really interesting book on its own, both because of the language play in that story, but also the middle story in here is a kind of absurdist parable with a talking donkey and border crossings, and that it's also a really interesting time capsule, because this was originally published in 1990, this translation is from 94, but it captures a kind of late 80s Berlin, and it's before reunification, and there's a lot of border crossings, and there's a lot of the cultural attitudes are not quite, well, not quite, are just not what they are now, even external to the content of the book. This edition was a time capsule because I had this from the library, and the label is North York Public Library, which, for non-Toronto people, Toronto amalgamated a number of smaller cities 25 years ago, so this is from before amalgamation, so that was funny too. So yeah, I think anybody who's spent any time in Berlin should absolutely read that, especially if they were there a number of years ago and have gone back, or have lived there at 2 points in their lives. That was great. In addition to being a convenient tie-in to this book, because I'd actually taken that out of the library, not realizing that one of the stories in there is actually one of the pieces that's being evaluated. I will say with regard to this, it is a little dry. This is very academic, so I don't know that I would recommend it to people who are not specifically interested in language play in German literature, or just the whole idea of the monolingual myth, because I think poking at that, especially if you can look at that and think of how that would relate to French or American or whatever, insert your imagined monolingual country, and apply it from there. But yeah, I thought that was fantastic. This, similarly, if you like language play, and if you have either lived in Berlin or spent a lot of time in Berlin, I think you will enjoy. Next up, I read Abdellah Taïa's Une mélancolie arabe, or an Arab melancholia is what the English translation is called. This is either an autobiographical novel or autofiction. The main character does have the same name as the author. And it's quite a short book, but it's also very short in terms of the sentence structure and in terms of the chapters and in terms of the moments, because this is not a book with a plot. What happens is we follow this main character at various points in his life. It opens with him in Morocco as a 12-year-old and almost being gang raped. We then get to a period where he is dating a Spanish-French guy and have been traveling from France to Morocco, and their relationship is turning out not to be much of a relationship. We then get a piece where he's working on a film in Cairo, and then we get a piece where he's just breaking up from a long-term relationship with an Algerian French guy. And each one is essentially floating through the memories of this character, or of the author, if you're gonna decide that this is primarily autobiographical, which I think it invites you to do to a certain extent. I saw a number of people picking this up back in January for the Invisible Cities project, when Morocco was one of the countries, because there are a few people who are trying to do a queer author for each country. And for Morocco, this is the number one recommendation that I think you get for that. So I had picked it up, having heard from other people who read it back in January. I did really enjoy the flow of this, but it is, as I said, very short. So if you were looking for something meaty and a more obvious kind of life commentary, you're not going to get that, because I do think this gets recommended on lists that imply that it's more of a educational experience, when it is not. It is very much an emotional experience where you're just being carried along with this character on his memories. And there was certainly commentary in the background about culture and class and immigration and religion and social expectations, but it is very background. It is very much about someone making choices, not always great choices, and the emotional repercussions of that. Next up is something that is tonally very different, and this is Safia Elhillo's Home is Not a Country. This is a novel in verse that is written for a young adult audience, and that I would say the marketing of this has misrepresented somewhat what the story is actually about. I had read the author's poetry collection for an adult audience, The January Children, a year or two ago, and I thought that was just spectacular. It was a really good collection of thought, and this captures a lot of the same things stylistically, the flow of the words and the way phrases are broken up, and the way there's kind of a use of lyrics from Arabic songs that are written as is, they're not romanized or anything, which I think stylistically is really fantastic. It works quite well. As a novel with a plot, and since this is for a teenage audience, I think you have to talk about it from more of a plot-based angle than a stylistic angle. I didn't think this 100% worked, because the build-up that we get, which is the main character's day-to-day life as she's going through high school. Stopping myself because I'm going to give away plot, but the build-up of her day-to-day high school life is a much higher percentage of this book than I think you would expect from the blurb. And the blurb suggests that when this moves into a kind of fabulist or magical realist segment, that will take up significantly more of the plot, and it doesn't. That actually comes quite late in the story, and it also doesn't take the angle that this is described as, which I'm going to mention because I think, because I had gone in expecting this particular thing to happen, when it didn't, I did feel like this was mismarketed, because that's not what it is. The blurb on this says that she is going to encounter a version of herself had her mother not moved to the United States from Sudan when she was pregnant with the character. That is not actually what happens. There is a point where the character imagines that she's going to experience that, but that's not actually the direction that the fabulist or magical realist elements take. and it goes in a different direction from that that's closer to time travel than parallel lives. Saying more than that would be a spoiler, but I feel like because it's mentioned in the marketing, I feel like it's worth saying that that's not actually what it was about. So I came away slightly disappointed, even though I liked it stylistically, because, and in part I think that's because the pacing is slightly off. I thought the high school portion was too high before we get to the fantasy section, but just outside of that, I was expecting a different kind of plot based on the marketing, and that's just not what it was. So let me share with you that that's not what it was. And finally, I read a collection of short stories by Miljenko Jergović called Sarajevo Marlboro, which is translated by Stela Tomasevic and has an introduction by Emile Alcalay, who I have mentioned in one of my last wrap-up videos. He also translated Sarajevo Blues, and he wrote From the Warring Factions himself. This book is a collection of stories that have a kind of mixing of the mundane and the extreme. All of them take place between 1985 and 1995, with the bulk of them happening in Sarajevo during the war in the early 90s. And it plays with the kind of minutiae of people's lives with some extreme happenings. The first story, which is in the 80s, involves a family on a road trip, and the child in that witnesses a vehicle accident that results in a death, and that opens, and then we go through stories about people who've witnessed war crimes and people who are just grumpy in their houses, and there happens to be a war going on outside. And the stories in this often take themselves almost to a point where you think, that's a little far-fetched, but it's always within the realm of possibility in a way that I thought was very compelling, and that kept any of the characters, even when the actions started bordering on absurd, the characters as we saw them were never absurd. They still maintained a kind of humanity all the time. So I thought this was very compelling, and it's just a shame that more of this author's work is not available in English. All right, I think this is where I'm going to cut this one off. So if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. If you've read any interesting other nonfiction that's looking at the culture around language and who owns language, and who owns particular languages, I'd love to hear about that. All right, that's it for now. Ciao.